The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a sheriff's deputy who had the decency to look embarrassed. Rachel Torres held the paper with hands that had forgotten how to stop shaking, reading words that gave her and Sophie exactly 14 days to vacate the studio apartment they'd called home for 8 months. Sophie pressed against her mother's leg, 6 years old and already fluent in the language of crisis, the kind of literacy no child should possess. Her backpack hung from thin shoulders, stuffed with the coloring books and stuffed rabbit she'd learned to keep ready, because sometimes home stopped being home without warning. "We have to leave." Her voice came small, careful, testing the weight of another ending. Rachel knelt on linoleum that had never been clean, met her daughter's eyes with a smile built from sheer will rather than genuine reassurance. "Just for a little while, baby. We're going to have an adventure." The word tasted like ash. Adventure was what you called homelessness when talking to a 6-year-old who'd already survived too many transitions. Rachel had been a planetarium director once, before the funding cuts. Before the divorce that had left her with Sophie and debt Kevin had strategically transferred into her name during the settlement. Before the cascade of financial collapse that had taught her exactly how fast stability could disintegrate. She counted their resources in the bathroom while Sophie watched cartoons, the volume barely audible because the neighbor in 2B complained about noise. $127 in her checking account. $43 in cash folded inside an old astronomy textbook. The Honda Civic parked 3 blocks away needed $300 in repairs she couldn't afford, which meant it was essentially decorative. A metal sculpture of transportation rather than actual mobility. 2 weeks of motels would consume everything and leave them sleeping in the Civic once it broke down completely. Rachel had done that math 3 times, hoping her calculations would somehow change. Mathematics didn't care about desperation. Numbers remained brutally objective regardless of how much you needed them to bend. Her phone buzzed. A text from Denise, her former colleague from the Riverside Planetarium. "Heard about the eviction. You can crash here for a few days if you need." Rachel's throat tightened. Denise meant well. Everyone meant well. But a few days was the lie people told themselves when offering help they couldn't sustain. Rachel had learned this lesson across 6 months of crashing with friends who became incrementally less friendly as days became weeks. Had watched welcome curdle into resentment as her presence transformed from temporary inconvenience into permanent problem. She couldn't do that again. Couldn't watch Sophie pick up on the subtle shift when generosity hit its limit. Couldn't explain to her daughter why another person who'd said stay as long as you need suddenly needed them gone. The phone sat heavy in her hand. Rachel opened her email out of habit, scanning for job responses that never came, scrolling past automated rejections and opportunities requiring certifications she couldn't afford. Her thumb hovered over the delete button when a subject line caught her attention. Torres estate. Final notice regarding property transfer. She opened it, expecting spam. Some scam about Nigerian princes or unclaimed lottery winnings. The sender was Morrison and Chun, attorneys at law, with a Riverside address Rachel recognized from the business district downtown. "Ms. Torres, this is our 3rd attempt to contact you regarding the estate of Harold Torres, deceased November 2024. As the sole surviving heir listed in Mr. Torres's will, you are entitled to property located at 4477 Observatory Drive, Riverside, California. The property consists of 2.3 acres and the structure formerly known as the Meridian Planetarium. Due to unpaid property taxes, $847, and the building's condemned status, the county intends to auction the property for back taxes on February 15th unless you claim your inheritance and satisfy the outstanding debt. Please contact our office immediately to discuss transfer of deed and tax settlement. Regards, Jennifer Chun, estate attorney." Rachel read it 3 times. Harold Torres, her grandfather, a man she'd met exactly twice, both times before age 5. Visits she barely remembered except for the smell of old books and the way he'd shown her star charts like they were treasure maps. He died. No one had told her. Or maybe they had, and she'd missed the notification between evictions and court dates and the grinding machinery of poverty that consumed attention until nothing else could penetrate. The Meridian Planetarium. Rachel knew the building. Everyone in Riverside knew it. A geodesic dome that had closed in 1987, sitting abandoned on the eastern edge of town where the desert started reclaiming developed land. She'd driven past it once during her own job search, seen the collapsed roof section and broken windows. The no trespassing signs posted by the county. Condemned status meant uninhabitable, meant structural failure serious enough that the building was considered dangerous, meant it was essentially worthless except as land value, and 2.3 acres in Riverside's dead zone weren't worth much. But $847 in back taxes was less than 2 weeks of motel rooms. And a condemned building still had walls and a roof, mostly. Better shelter than a broken Honda Civic. Rachel called the law office from the bathroom, keeping her voice low while Sophie remained absorbed by cartoons. Jennifer Chun answered on the second ring, sounding surprised to finally reach her missing heir. Ms. Torres, thank goodness. We've been trying to locate you for 3 months. I've been moving around. The euphemism felt inadequate but honest. The email said my grandfather left me the old planetarium. The property, yes. Mr. Torres purchased the building and land in 1992 from the county when it went up for auction. Paid $12,000 cash. He attempted some restoration work, but never completed it. The structure has been vacant since his death. Rachel's engineering mind automatically cataloged questions. Foundation integrity, roof stability, water damage assessment, electrical hazards. Then the more pressing question, is it safe enough to live in? Chun paused, and in that silence Rachel heard the answer. The county condemned it in 2019. Structural engineers cited roof collapse in the main dome, foundation cracks, possible asbestos in the insulation. Living there would be inadvisable. But it's mine if I pay the back taxes? Legally, yes. Though I should mention that repair costs would likely exceed the property value. The sensible option would be selling the land once you take ownership. There's a developer interested in acquiring it for $15,000. You'd net about $14,000 after taxes and legal fees. $14,000 represented 4 months of breathing room. Time to find work, secure stable housing, give Sophie some semblance of normalcy. Rachel felt the number pull at her like gravity. But 4 months would end. Rachel had learned that temporary salvation just delayed the next crisis unless something fundamental changed. And selling meant nowhere to go immediately. Meant motels and shelters and the Honda until the money found other emergencies to solve. What if I want to keep it? Take ownership, pay the taxes, try to make it livable. Chen's tone shifted to carefully neutral. That's your right. But Ms. Torres, I've seen the inspection reports. The building is dangerous. Taking your daughter there could raise child welfare concerns. The threat hung delicately. Not quite accusation, but close enough to land. Rachel had spent 18 months terrified of child services, of some mandatory reporter deciding that poverty equaled neglect. That loving Sophie desperately, but being unable to provide stability, warranted intervention. I understand the risks. Can you email me the property deed and tax information? I'll send everything today. The tax deadline is the 28th. 3 weeks. After that, the county auctions regardless of your claim. Rachel ended the call and stared at Sophie's back, at the small shoulders that carried too much awareness of adult problems. The cartoon played on, bright colors and simple conflicts that resolved in 22 minutes. Nothing like the world Sophie actually inhabited. That night, after putting Sophie to bed in the apartment they had 2 weeks left to occupy, Rachel researched the Meridian Planetarium on free library Wi-Fi. Found architectural renderings from 1962 showing an elegant geodesic dome designed by someone who'd studied under Buckminster Fuller. Articles from the grand opening celebrated it as Riverside's gateway to the cosmos. Photographs from the 70s showed school groups gathered under the projection dome, faces upturned toward artificial stars. The closure in 1987 came abruptly. Budget cuts, maintenance costs, shifting educational priorities. The building sat empty through the 90s, deteriorating slowly. County inspection photos from 2019 showed the damage Chun had mentioned. Collapsed dome section, water infiltration, vegetation growing through cracks in the foundation. But beneath the decay, Rachel could see the structure's bones. Geodesic domes distributed weight efficiently when properly maintained. The framework was steel, which didn't rot like wood. If the foundation was sound and the collapsed section could be isolated, temporary repairs might create livable space in the intact portions. It was insane. She knew this objectively. Taking a 6-year-old to a condemned building rated somewhere between reckless and criminal on the parenting spectrum. But the alternative was homelessness with certainty versus homelessness with possibility. At least the planetarium offered walls and the chance to build towards something instead of simply surviving day to day until money ran out. Rachel withdrew $850 from her checking account the next morning, paid the property taxes at the county office where a clerk processed the payment with bureaucratic indifference, received a stamped receipt that felt heavier than paper should. Jennifer Chun had the deed transferred by end of business. Rachel signed documents in the law office while Sophie colored at a conference table, becoming the legal owner of 2.3 acres and a condemned building. The attorney handed over keys that looked older than Rachel, brass worn smooth by decades of use. Good luck, Miss Torres. You're going to need it. The drive to Observatory Drive took 20 minutes through Riverside's eastern sprawl, past strip malls and auto shops, into the transitional zone where city met desert. The road degraded from asphalt to gravel, houses thinning until the planetarium appeared like something from an abandoned theme park. The geodesic dome rose 40 feet at its peak, white panels gone gray with age and grime. The collapsed section gaped like a missing tooth, exposing interior framework to the elements. The parking lot was cracked concrete with weeds, pushing through like the earth was slowly reclaiming what humans had borrowed. Rachel parked the Honda, killed the engine, sat gripping the steering wheel while nausea rolled through her stomach. This was a mistake. Obviously, catastrophically a mistake. Sophie pressed her face to the window. Is this the planetarium? It looks like a giant golf ball that broke. The description was accurate enough to hurt. Rachel forced herself to open the door, to step onto gravel that crunched under her sneakers. The January air was cold, dry desert wind that smelled like dust and creosote. They approached slowly. Rachel held Sophie's hand too tightly, every protective instinct screaming to turn around. The main entrance was a steel door set into concrete, padlocked with a chain that had oxidized into red-brown decay. She tried Harold's key, half expecting it wouldn't fit. The lock resisted, then yielded. The chain fell away with a sound like breaking bones. Rachel pulled the door open, revealing darkness that smelled of mildew and time. She found her phone's flashlight, swept the beam across an entrance hallway with peeling linoleum and walls showing water damage in abstract patterns. Stay close to me. Don't touch anything. They moved deeper into the structure. The hallway opened into the main projection room, and Rachel's breath caught despite the decay. The dome soared overhead, geodesic panels creating geometric patterns against the sky visible through the collapsed section. The projection equipment sat in the center on a raised platform, massive Zeiss projector covered in dust and bird droppings, but still magnificent in its mechanical complexity. Rows of seats faced the center, fabric rotted away, leaving metal frames. The floor was concrete, cracked but structurally sound as far as Rachel could assess. She tested weight carefully, listening for sounds that would indicate foundation failure. Sophie wandered toward the projector, eyes wide. Can it still make stars? I don't know, baby. Probably not. But Rachel moved to the machine anyway, professional curiosity overcoming caution. She'd spent 12 years working with projection equipment, knew the mechanisms intimately. This model was ancient 1960s technology, but the fundamentals remained consistent. She found the power panel, followed conduit to where electrical should connect. The wiring had been disconnected, capped off properly at some point. No power meant no immediate hazards, but also no functionality. The space felt larger than it should, amplified by emptiness and the way light filtered through the damaged dome. Rachel's imagination supplied what it had been. Children gathered in darkness while artificial cosmos wheeled overhead. The wonder of making the universe comprehensible through mechanical precision. She felt a pull she didn't trust. This building wanted saving, wanted someone to care about it again. But buildings didn't have wants. Only people did, and Rachel's wants had been proving unreliable guides lately. They explored systematically. Found offices behind the projection room, small spaces with desks still present, filing cabinets full of old show schedules and maintenance logs. A break room with a sink that produced brown water when Rachel tested the valve. A storage area stacked with boxes of miscellaneous equipment. And in the basement, access through a stairwell marked authorized personnel only. Rachel found something that made her stop breathing. The basement was dry, structurally sound, temperature controlled by the earth itself, staying cool when the desert above baked. 3 rooms connected by a hallway, concrete walls showing no cracks, no water damage, no visible decay. Harold had been living here. Recently, the evidence was unmistakable. A cot with blankets, folded military precise. A camp stove, propane tank attached. Shelves with canned goods, some dated within the last year. A desk with papers organized in careful stacks. Rachel moved to the desk, hands shaking. Found utility bills paid through November 2024, the month Harold died. Found maintenance logs documenting his work on the Planetarium, plans for restoration that had consumed the last years of his life. Found a letter, sealed in an envelope with her name written across the front in careful script. She opened it with fingers that had forgotten steadiness. Sophie sat on the cot, exploring blankets with the pragmatic curiosity of a child who'd learned to assess new sleeping arrangements quickly. Rachel, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you found what I left. Good. You were always clever, even as a small child. I saw it in how you studied my star charts, asking questions that showed real understanding. I bought this building because I couldn't bear watching it die. 32 years I spent trying to restore it properly, but money runs out faster than hope. I have $4,000 in savings, coordinates to my bank account in the desk. It's not much, but it's yours now along with this building and everything in it. The planetarium is condemned, which means the county thinks it's worthless. They're wrong. The main dome section is damaged. Yes, but the framework is sound. The foundation is solid. The projection equipment can be restored by someone who understands the mechanics. I always believed you'd come back to astronomy. You had the passion for it, the precision mind it requires. Life may have taken you different directions, but some callings wait patiently. This building holds something I never told anyone. Not because I wanted to keep secrets, but because some truths need the right person at the right time. You're desperate enough now to search properly, humble enough to recognize value when others see only ruin. Look where the stars point to Earth, where the ceiling becomes floor, where projection meets foundation. The dome remembers what the ground conceals. Harold Torres. Rachel read it twice, throat tight with emotions she couldn't name. Grief for a grandfather she'd never really known. Confusion at cryptic instructions that sounded like riddles. Frustration at messages delivered too late to matter in the way she needed immediately. Sophie had curled up on the cot, exhaustion pulling her towards sleep. The past weeks had been grinding, constant movement without rest, and her small body was finally demanding payment. Rachel let her sleep, covered her with blankets that smelled like mothballs and old man in time. Then she explored the basement rooms more carefully, searching for what Harold's letter suggested was hidden. The first room held storage, boxes of old promotional materials and broken equipment. The second was empty except for a water heater that no longer functioned. The third was Harold's living space, where the desk and cot created a monastic existence. Look where the stars point to Earth, where the ceiling becomes floor. Rachel returned to the main projection room, stood beneath the Zeiss projector, followed its axis downward. The platform it sat on was elevated 3 feet, creating a circular stage. She knelt, examined the base, found nothing unusual. Where projection meets foundation. She descended to the basement again, stood directly beneath the projection room, studied the ceiling, looking for seams or irregularities in the concrete. Found nothing. The dome remembers what the ground conceals. Rachel moved through the basement hallway, examining walls with her phone's flashlight at oblique angles to catch shadows that might indicate hidden panels. The concrete was smooth, professionally poured, showing no obvious breaks. She returned to Harold's room, sat at his desk, fought the urge to scream. She'd been hoping for something immediate, something that would solve the crisis of the next 2 weeks. Instead, she had riddles in a condemned building and a sleeping daughter who deserved better than a mother chasing grandfather's cryptic last messages. The desk drawers held expected items: pens, notepads, receipts organized by date. The bottom drawer stuck slightly, warped wood catching on the frame. Rachel worked it gently until it slid open. Inside was a leather journal, pages filled with Harold's handwriting. She lifted it carefully, felt the weight of accumulated thought. The entries dated back to 1992, when he'd first purchased the Planetarium. January 15th, 1992, bought the Meridian for $12,000. Everyone thinks I'm crazy. Margaret said I'm throwing away our retirement on a building that's already dead. Maybe she's right, but I can't let it just disappear. Someone has to care. The entries continued through years of restoration work, financial struggles, small victories, and larger setbacks. Rachel skimmed, looking for anything that connected to the letter's instructions. August 3rd, 1998. The projection platform is original to the 1962 construction. Beneath it is the building's foundation anchoring system, steel reinforcement that goes down 12 feet. I always wondered why they built it so deep for a relatively light dome structure. August 10th, 1998. Started examining the foundation access during routine maintenance. Found something unexpected in the eastern quadrant. Not structural damage, but an intentional void. Chamber approximately 6 by 8 feet sealed with concrete, but accessible through the original maintenance tunnel. Rachel's pulse accelerated. She flipped pages rapidly, searching for follow-up entries. August 17th, 1998. Opened the chamber today. What I found changes everything. Have to decide what to do with this information. Who to tell? If I tell anyone. August 24th, 1998. Decided to seal it again. Wait. Some discoveries need time to mature into usefulness rather than crisis. The entries became deliberately vague after that. References to the foundation situation and chamber maintenance, without specifics. Harold had found something and chosen to hide it again, preserve it for a future he couldn't predict. Rachel stood, moved back to the projection room with urgency that bordered on panic. The eastern quadrant would be toward the collapsed section, where structural damage was worst. She examined the platform base carefully, looking for access panels or maintenance hatches. Found nothing obvious. The platform was solid concrete with the projection mount bolted through to the foundation below. But if Harold had accessed something in 1998, there had to be an entry point. She descended to the basement again, oriented herself to match the eastern quadrant of the projection room above. Stood in Harold's living space, directly beneath where the projector sat. The wall looked identical to every other basement wall. Concrete, smooth, unremarkable. Rachel ran her hands across the surface, feeling for temperature differentials that might indicate hollow spaces behind. Her fingers caught on something. A slight depression, barely perceptible. She angled her phone's light across the surface at sharp incline. Saw what she'd been missing. A thin seam, hairline crack that ran floor to ceiling in a rectangle 3 feet wide and 6 feet tall. Not damage, but design, carefully hidden but present for those who knew to look. Rachel pressed against the concrete, testing whether it would move. Nothing happened. She examined the seam more carefully, looking for a release mechanism or hidden latch. Found it at waist height. A small indentation, easily mistaken for concrete imperfection. She pressed her thumb into it, heard a click so quiet it might have been imagination. The wall panel swung inward on hinges that shrieked from decades of disuse, revealing darkness beyond that smelled of earth and sealed spaces. Rachel's hands trembled as she raised her phone, flashlight cutting into a chamber that shouldn't exist. The space was exactly as Harold had described. 6 feet by 8, concrete-lined, climate-controlled by the Earth itself. And in the center, resting on a platform built from cinder blocks, sat a steel footlocker. Military surplus, painted desert tan, sealed with a padlock that looked newer than the building around it. Rachel's engineering background screamed caution. Unknown chambers, unsecured structures, could contain hazards beyond obvious structural concerns. But desperation had its own logic. She stepped through the opening, crossed the small space, examined the footlocker without touching. Found Harold's initials stenciled on the lid. HD, simple and declarative. The padlock required a key she didn't have. Rachel pulled her phone back, took photographs of everything, documenting the chamber, the footlocker, creating evidence of discovery that felt like preparation for some future she couldn't articulate. She returned to the basement proper, examined the keyring Harold had left in the desk, found a small silver key that looked appropriate for a padlock, returned to the chamber with mounting hope and equal fear. The key fit. The lock opened. Rachel lifted the footlocker lid with hands that had stopped obeying her entirely. Inside, wrapped in canvas that had protected them for decades, were objects that made no immediate sense. Wooden crates, smaller than she'd expected, stamped with faded text she couldn't read in the flashlight's uneven illumination. Rachel lifted one crate carefully, carried it to the basement room where better light from the hallway helped, set on Harold's desk, worked the lid free with the screwdriver she found in his tool drawer. The nails yielded with protests that sounded like breaking glass. The lid fell away, revealing contents that stopped Rachel's breathing entirely. Meteorites. Dozens of them, each wrapped individually in cloth, labeled with coordinates and dates and compositional analysis. Beautiful specimens, some showing regmaglyphs from atmospheric entry, others displaying fusion crust that caught her phone's light in ways that seemed almost organic. Rachel unwrapped one carefully, a fragment roughly the size of her fist. Iron meteorite, judging by the weight and the way oxidation had created patterns across the surface. The label read Canyon Diablo, 1964, 47.3% Fe, 5.2% Ni. Crystalline structure confirms authenticity. Her knowledge of meteorite values was theoretical rather than practical. But she knew collectors paid substantial sums for authentic specimens with provenance. A Canyon Diablo fragment this size might be worth $2,000, maybe more. She counted the crates. 12 total. If they all held similar quantities, Harold had hidden a collection worth tens of thousands. Maybe more, depending on specimen rarity. Rachel's hand shook as she opened the second crate. Found more meteorites. These labeled with locations she recognized from astronomy textbooks. Hembury craters, Secotalon Gibeon. Each fragment documented with scientific precision that would satisfy even skeptical buyers. The third crate held something different. She lifted the canvas wrapping, found bound stacks of paper, pulled one free, saw it was a stock certificate. Ornate border, official seals, text that proclaimed ownership of shares in something called Stellar Mining Corporation. The certificate was made out to Harold Torres. 5,000 shares, dated March 1963. Rachel's pulse hammered. She examined other certificates, found similar patterns. Different quantities, spanning dates from 1963 through 1972, but all representing ownership in the same company. She counted quickly. 47 certificates total. Her hands fumbled with the phone, searching Stellar Mining Corporation while crouched in a basement room beside a sleeping 6-year-old. Found initial results that made her vision swim. Stellar Mining had merged with Consolidated Asteroid Resources in 1987, which had been acquired by Deep Space Ventures in 2003, which had gone public in 2015 as Artemis Extraction Industries, currently trading on NASDAQ. Rachel searched stock conversion rates, merger ratios, the arcane mathematics of corporate transformations across 6 decades. Her engineer's training made her comfortable with calculations, but the numbers she was arriving at couldn't be correct. Harold's 47 certificates represented 180,000 shares in a company that had evolved through multiple iterations. If the mergers had honored shareholder equity, those shares would have converted to Artemis extraction at rates determined by each transaction. She worked backward through financial filings, found merger terms buried in SEC documents. The math was complex but unambiguous. 180,000 original shares, converted at 1.3 multiplier in 1987, became 234,000, which converted at 0.75 in 2003, became 175,500, which split 4-1 when Artemis went public in 2015, became 702,000 shares. Artemis Extraction Industries currently traded at $862 per share. Rachel stopped breathing, ran the calculation again, certain she'd made a mistake. 702,000 shares at $862 equaled $605,124,000. $600 million. More or less. Hidden in a condemned planetarium by a grandfather who died, believing his granddaughter might someday need it. The number was impossible. Had to be impossible. People didn't inherit that kind of wealth by accident. There were laws preventing it, regulations ensuring shares got transferred properly, notifications sent to heirs, systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of forgotten fortune. But Harold's letter echoed in Rachel's mind. Some truths need the right person at the right time. You're desperate enough now to search properly. She photographed everything. The certificates, the meteorite collection, the chamber itself. Took 57 pictures with shaking hands. Uploaded them to cloud storage using the basement's surprisingly functional Wi-Fi that Harold must have maintained until his death. Then carefully, methodically, she rewrapped everything. Returned the crates to the footlocker, secured it, closed the hidden panel, made the chamber invisible again. Sophie stirred on the cot, made the small sounds that preceded waking. Rachel moved to her daughter, smoothed hair that had gotten tangled during sleep, prepared herself to maintain normalcy when nothing would ever be normal again. If the shares were authentic, if they'd actually converted properly through all the mergers, if Artemis Extraction recognized the old certificates as legitimate claims, if a dozen other complications didn't render Harold's hidden wealth worthless despite its theoretical value. Rachel needed a lawyer. Someone who specialized in corporate securities and estate law and the kind of high-stakes complications she'd never imagined confronting. Someone who would work on contingency, because she still only had $73 in her checking account and 2 weeks until eviction became finalized. Sophie opened her eyes, blinked in the basement's dim light, focused on her mother's face. "Did we find treasure?" Rachel's throat closed. She pulled her daughter into a hug that was too tight, too desperate, holding on to the one thing that had remained constant through every collapse. "Maybe, baby. Maybe we did. But first they had to survive the next 2 weeks. Had to figure out how to live in a condemned building without attracting attention that would bring child services. Had to keep Sophie safe, while Rachel navigated legal complexities that existed so far beyond her experience they might as well be theoretical. The planetarium dome rose above them, broken but standing. Harold's letter sat in Rachel's pocket like promise and threat braided together. And in the hidden chamber beneath the projection platform, $600 million waited patiently to either save them or destroy everything. Rachel locked the basement door, gathered their meager possessions from the Honda, carried sleeping Sophie to the cot that smelled like her grandfather and decades of patient hiding. Outside, the January desert grew cold. Stars appeared overhead, visible through the collapsed dome section, turning the planetarium into what it had always meant to be. A place where Earth met cosmos, where desperation met discovery, where one woman's last hope intersected with her grandfather's final gift. Rachel closed her eyes, listening to Sophie breathe, feeling the weight of possibilities she couldn't yet process. The adventure had begun. Rachel woke to sunlight streaming through the collapsed dome section, illuminating dust motes that danced like miniature galaxies. For 3 seconds, she forgot where they were. Then the cot's unfamiliar hardness registered, the basement's mineral smell, the reality of sleeping in a condemned building with her 6-year-old daughter. Sophie was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor, examining one of Harold's old star charts spread across the concrete. Her small finger traced constellation patterns with the focused intensity she brought to puzzles and problems that caught her interest. "Mom, what's a pulsar?" Rachel pushed herself upright, every muscle protesting the cot's lack of support. "It's a rotating neutron star that emits beams of electromagnetic radiation, like a lighthouse in space." Sophie nodded, absorbing this with the casual acceptance of a child who'd grown up with an astrophysicist mother. Grandpa Harold wrote about them a lot. He said they keep perfect time, better than any clock humans ever made. The casual reference to Harold as Grandpa landed strangely. Sophie had never met him, knew him only through the artifacts he'd left behind. But children created relationships from available materials, building family from whoever's legacy surrounded them. Rachel stood carefully, tested the basement's temperature. Cold, but not dangerously so. The concrete retained yesterday's heat while insulating against the desert night's chill. Survivable, barely. "We need to get you to school." Sophie's face fell. "Do I have to go? Can't we stay here and explore?" The temptation pulled at Rachel. Keep Sophie close. Maintain control of their situation. Avoid the questions that would come when teachers noticed they were living somewhere new. But missing school meant truancy reports, which meant attention from authorities who might decide a condemned planetarium wasn't appropriate housing for a minor. "School first. Then we'll explore together this afternoon." They washed using bottled water and the basement's small sink, which produced flow that ran clearer than yesterday, but still carried a metallic tang. Rachel dressed Sophie in clothes from their garbage bags, the same outfit she'd worn twice this week, because laundry required resources they didn't have. The Honda started on the third try, engine coughing before settling into an unsteady idle that promised expensive repairs in the near future. Rachel drove to Sophie's elementary school, dropped at the front entrance where other children streamed toward classrooms, normal kids with normal problems who went home to houses with heat and food, and parents who weren't hiding in abandoned buildings. Sophie hugged her mother with the fierce intensity that had become their parting ritual. "You'll be here when school ends?" "I promise, baby. 3 o'clock, right here." Rachel watched until Sophie disappeared inside, then drove to the Riverside Public Library, where free Wi-Fi meant she could research without depleting her phone's data. Found a corner table away from other patrons, opened her laptop that was held together with electrical tape and hope. First priority, verify the stock certificate's authenticity and value. She started with Artemis Extraction Industries, pulled their investor relations page, found contact information for their transfer agent, the company that managed shareholder records and processed stock certificates. Called the number with hands that wanted to shake, forced her voice into professional neutrality. "Computer share, this is David speaking. How may I help you? I have some old stock certificates I'm trying to verify. They're from a predecessor company that eventually became Artemis Extraction through several mergers. I can help with that. What's the original company name?" "Stellar Mining Corporation. Certificates dated 1963 through 1972. A pause. Keyboard clicking. Stellar Mining merged with Consolidated Asteroid Resources in 1987, which was acquired by Deep Space Ventures in 2003, which restructured as Artemis Extraction in 2015. If the original shareholder maintained ownership through all transitions, those shares would have converted to current Artemis stock. Rachel's heart hammered against her ribs. How would I verify conversion rates and current share count? I need to see the actual certificates. Can you email photographs? I'll have our research team trace the lineage and provide a statement of current value if the shares are legitimate. She sent 20 images from her phone, high-resolution scans of Herald certificates showing every detail. Serial numbers, issue dates, signature blocks, the ornate borders that suggested an era when stock ownership was ceremonial rather than electronic. I'm showing receipt of your images. Give us 3 business days for full analysis. We'll contact you with findings. 3 days felt simultaneously too long and too fast. Rachel thanked David, ended the call, sat staring at her laptop while patrons moved around her living normal lives where 3-day waits didn't determine whether you had $600 million or nothing. She forced herself to pivot to the second priority, legal representation. Finding an attorney who specialized in corporate securities and worked on contingency was like searching for a specific star in a galaxy of irrelevant lights. Most securities lawyers worked for firms that billed hourly, required retainers measured in tens of thousands. The few contingency attorneys Rachel found focused on class action lawsuits or personal injury, not obscure estate claims involving decades-old stock certificates. After 2 hours of searching, she found Marcus Webb, practicing out of a small office in downtown Riverside. His website was basic, almost apologetically simple, but his credentials were legitimate. Stanford Law, 15 years specializing in shareholder disputes and corporate securities, several successful cases against companies trying to dilute or ignore legitimate ownership claims. His fee structure was clearly stated, 25% contingency on recovered value, no upfront costs, free initial consultation. Rachel called, expecting voicemail. Marcus answered personally, voice carrying the rough warmth of someone who'd chosen solo practice over corporate law's polish. Webb Legal. Marcus speaking. Mr. Webb, my name is Rachel Torres. I inherited some old stock certificates from my grandfather, and I need help determining if they're valid and how to claim them if they are. What company? Stellar Mining Corporation, which eventually became Artemis Extraction Industries through a series of mergers. The certificates represent 180,000 original shares from the 1960s and 70s. Silence stretched long enough that Rachel thought the call had dropped. Then Marcus spoke carefully, like someone trying not to spook a nervous animal. Ms. Torres, if those shares converted properly through the merger chain, you're talking about significant value. Potentially hundreds of millions of dollars. I know. That's why I need an attorney who understands how to navigate this without it all falling apart. Can you come to my office tomorrow? Bring the certificates, any documentation about your grandfather's ownership, proof of your inheritance rights. We'll need to build an airtight case before approaching Artemis. They scheduled for 2 p.m. after Rachel could drop Sophie at school and before pickup. She spent the rest of the morning researching Artemis Extraction, understanding what she was potentially claiming ownership of. The company mined rare earth elements from asteroid deposits, using robotic extractors that operated in the belt between Mars and Jupiter. Technology that had seemed like science fiction 20 years ago, but was now simply expensive industrial practice. Artemis was privately held but publicly traded, market cap around $140 billion, annual revenue exceeding $8 billion. Rachel's potential 702,000 shares would represent 0.5% ownership, a fraction that sounded small until converted to dollar value or voting rights. Large enough that the company would have legal obligations to recognize her claim if legitimate. Large enough to attract attention she wasn't prepared to handle. Her phone buzzed. Text from the school nurse. Sophie has a fever of 101.3. Please come pick her up. Rachel's stomach dropped. Fever meant illness, which meant medical care they couldn't afford, which meant decisions about emergency rooms versus waiting it out, calculations that balanced Sophie's well-being against financial catastrophe. She drove to the school in the Honda that was making new concerning sounds, found Sophie in the nurse's office looking small and miserable. The nurse's expression carried professional concern and something else. Judgment, maybe, or recognition that Rachel's clothes were too worn, her exhaustion too visible, her circumstances questionable. Sophie says you're staying somewhere new. Rachel's defenses activated instantly. We just moved. Temporary situation while I handle my grandfather's estate. And where is that? The question felt loaded. Too specific, too interested. Rachel kept her voice neutral. The old planetarium on Observatory Drive. My grandfather owned it. We're fixing it up. The nurse's eyebrows rose slightly. The condemned building? I didn't realize anyone was living there. We're not living there long term. Just temporary while estate matters get resolved. The lie sat bitter but necessary. Rachel signed Sophie out, carried her daughter to the Honda, drove back to the planetarium while monitoring her temperature with palm pressed to forehead. Back in the basement, Rachel settled Sophie on the cot with water and children's ibuprofen bought with precious dollars she could barely spare. The fever responded slowly, dropping to 100.1 over 2 hours, while Sophie dozed fitfully. Rachel used the time to explore the building more systematically, assessing what could be salvaged versus what required professional intervention. The main projection room showed the most dramatic damage. The collapsed dome section had let water infiltrate for years, rotting the seats and damaging floor sections near the breach. But the eastern two-thirds remained surprisingly intact. The projection platform was solid concrete, the Zeiss projector corroded but structurally complete. She found the electrical panel in a maintenance room, tray circuits that had been properly disconnected rather than simply abandoned. Harold's work, presumably. Someone who understood that leaving live wires in a building slated for demolition created liability. The water system was functional but questionable. City supply still connected, though the county had probably intended to terminate service when the building was condemned. Rachel made a note to call the utility company, establish legal service in her name, ensure they wouldn't face sudden disconnection. In the storage rooms, she found boxes of Harold's research. Astronomical observations recorded with obsessive detail. Calculations for optimal projection angles. Notes about meteorite hunting in the Arizona desert. Coordinates and dates, and specimen descriptions. One box held financial records dating back to 1963. Rachel pulled files systematically, constructing her grandfather's economic history. He'd worked as a machinist for aerospace contractors throughout the 60s and 70s, steady income that funded modest living and aggressive stock purchases in stellar mining. A letter from 1964 explained his investment strategy. Harold had helped design precision instruments for space missions, worked alongside engineers who were planning asteroid mining as a serious future industry. When stellar mining incorporated to develop that technology, he'd invested everything he could spare, believing the future would prove him right. The future had, just decades later than Harold had anticipated, after he'd stopped checking stock values, after the certificates had been filed away and forgotten, while he focused on restoring a planetarium that consumed his money faster than stocks could accumulate value. Rachel found a folder labeled Estate Planning containing Harold's will. Simple document leaving everything to his granddaughter Rachel Torres. No mention of stock certificates or hidden wealth, just generic language about all assets and property. Another folder held correspondence with the county about the planetarium's condemned status. Harold had fought the designation, submitted engineering reports proving the structure was reparable, argued that historical significance should warrant preservation rather than demolition. The county had responded with bureaucratic indifference. The building posed potential liability. Repairs would exceed property value. The land would serve the community better as a solar farm or warehouse development. Harold had withdrawn from the fight in 2022, let the condemnation stand, shifted to quietly maintaining the basement as livable space while the structure above slowly deteriorated. Planning, Rachel realized, for exactly this scenario. For someone desperate enough to need shelter in a building everyone else had written off. Sophie woke around 4 p.m., fever down to 99.2, asking for food with the first genuine appetite she'd shown all day. Rachel heated canned soup on Harold's camp stove, served it with crackers that were stale but edible. They ate sitting on the cot together, Sophie leaning against her mother's side with the unconscious trust that never failed to make Rachel's chest ache. Whatever mistakes she'd made, whatever wrong turns had led them here, Sophie still believed her mother would protect her, would find solutions, would somehow make everything work. Are we really going to live here? Sophie's voice was small, testing whether honesty was safe. Rachel chose truth over comfort. For a while, yes. Until I figure out what to do with Grandpa Harold's stock certificates. If they're worth what I think they're worth, we won't have to worry about money anymore. How much money? Rachel paused, searching for numbers a 6-year-old could comprehend. Enough that you could go to any college you wanted. Enough that we could buy a real house with heating that works and a yard for you to play in. Sophie processed this with her characteristic seriousness. What if the stocks aren't worth anything? Then we'll figure something else out. We always do. The confidence in Rachel's voice was manufactured, a performance for her daughter's benefit. But Sophie accepted it, nodded against her mother's ribs, finished her soup with the methodical determination of a child who'd learned not to waste food. That night, Rachel descended to the hidden chamber alone while Sophie slept. Opened the footlocker with hands that no longer shook quite so badly. Examined the stock certificates with her phone's flashlight. 47 certificates, each one potentially worth millions if the conversion rates held. She photographed them individually, creating detailed records, backup documentation in case something happened to the originals. The meteorite collection deserved similar attention. Rachel unwrapped each specimen, photographed it with scale reference, recorded the labels Harold had meticulously created. Canyon Diablo, Seco Talon, Gibeon, Henberry. Names that represented impact events spanning millennia. Pieces of cosmic history that had survived atmospheric entry to become collectibles. She researched current meteorite market values, found that Harold collection was worth more than she'd initially estimated. Authenticated specimens with clear provenance commanded premium prices. The Canyon Diablo fragments alone might bring $30,000 to $40,000 from serious collectors. Not $600 million, but enough to matter. Enough to serve as immediate liquidity while stock claims processed through legal channels. Rachel selected 3 smaller specimens, ones valuable enough to generate needed funds, but not so rare that selling them would be foolish. Wrapped them carefully, returned the rest to the footlocker, sealed the chamber. The next morning, after dropping Sophie at school with the fever successfully resolved, Rachel drove to Marcus Webb's office. A modest suite in a building that had been renovated in the 1980s and hadn't been updated since. Marcus met her in the lobby, mid-40s with graying hair and the slightly rumpled appearance of someone who prioritized substance over presentation. His office was organized chaos. File boxes stacked against walls, a desk buried under documents, whiteboards covered in legal strategy diagrams. But his eyes were sharp, assessing Rachel with the focused attention of someone who'd learned to read people quickly. Ms. Torres, thanks for coming in. May I see the certificates? Rachel handed over the folder containing Harold's stock certificates, watched Marcus examine them with a jeweler's precision. He pulled reference books, cross-checked serial numbers, verified signatures against historical records. These are authentic, original issue certificates from Stellar Mining Corporation, properly executed, never canceled. Serial numbers fall within the documented range for the 1963 through 1972 issuance periods. Rachel's pulse quickened. So they're legitimate? They're real, yes. Whether they converted properly through all the corporate transitions is the complicated question. He pulled up files on his computer, showed Rachel merger documents and shareholder agreements spanning 6 decades. Stellar Mining merged with Consolidated Asteroid Resources in 1987. Terms were 1 share of Consolidated for every 0.77 shares of Stellar. Your grandfather's 180,000 shares became 234,000. Marcus clicked through more documents. Consolidated was acquired by Deep Space Ventures in 2003. Conversion rate was 0.75 shares of DSV for each share of Consolidated. 234,000 became 175,500. DSV restructured as Artemis Extraction in 2015 when they went public. 4-to-1 split. 175,500 became 702,000 shares of Artemis. He turned the screen toward Rachel, showed the current stock price. $862 per share. If Artemis recognizes your claim, you own stock worth approximately $605 million. But there are significant complications. Rachel's throat was too dry to speak. She nodded for Marcus to continue. First, the 2015 restructuring required all shareholders to re-register within 180 days or risk having their shares classified as abandoned. Your grandfather died in 2024, so he couldn't respond to that notification. Question is whether Artemis properly notified shareholders at Herald's last known address. Second, companies have been known to fight claims like this. They'll argue the shares were abandoned, that you missed filing deadlines, that the statute of limitations has expired. They have expensive lawyers whose job is making problems disappear. Third, even if we win, the process takes time. Maybe a year, maybe 3. During that period, you still need to survive, keep your daughter safe, avoid complications that could undermine your claim. Rachel absorbed this, fighting the urge to laugh or cry or both. What do you recommend? Marcus leaned back, fingers steepled. I recommend we file immediately with Artemis, present your claim, demand recognition. Simultaneously, I'll research whether they properly notified Herald in 2015. If they fail notification requirements, we have leverage. My fee is 25% of whatever we recover. If we settle for $400 million, I take $100 million. You net $300 million. If we get nothing, you owe me nothing except filing costs, which I'll front. Rachel did the math instantly. Even 25% of $600 million was more money than she could conceptualize. And $300 million after Marcus's fee would still be generational wealth beyond imagination. Let's do it. Marcus smiled, genuine warmth breaking through professional reserve. I was hoping you'd say that. I'll draft a formal claim letter today, send it certified mail to Artemis's corporate office and their transfer agent. We should hear back within 2 weeks. Rachel left the meeting feeling simultaneously hopeful and terrified. 2 weeks of waiting while living in a condemned building with a 6-year-old. 2 weeks of maintaining normalcy while sitting on a potential fortune that might evaporate under legal scrutiny. She drove to a coin and collectibles dealer in downtown Riverside, brought the 3 meteorite specimens she'd selected. The dealer, a man named Frank who looked like he'd been handling space rocks since the Apollo era, examined them with practiced efficiency. Kenyan Diablo fragment, nice regmaglyphs, about 300 grams. I can give you $2,800. Seco Talon individual, 180 grams with flight marks. $1,600. Henberry shrapnel piece, 90 grams. $450. Total, $4,850. Rachel negotiated up to $5,200 by showing Herald's documentation, proving authenticity and provenance. Frank counted out cash, mostly hundreds, into Rachel's hands. More money than she'd held in 18 months. Enough to buy food and clothes and school supplies. Enough to pay for repairs to the Honda. Enough to create a buffer between immediate desperation and the waiting period while Marcus fought for the stocks. Rachel bought groceries at a discount supermarket, filled the Honda's trunk with non-perishables and fresh food that wouldn't spoil in the basement's cool temperature. Bought Sophie new clothes that actually fit, replaced the worn shoes she'd been wearing for 8 months. Paid $280 to get the Honda's check engine light diagnosed and repaired. When she picked Sophie up from school, her daughter noticed the change immediately. Did the stocks work? Are we rich now? Rachel kept her voice carefully neutral. Not yet, but I sold some of Grandpa Harold's meteorite collection. That gave us enough money to be comfortable while we wait for the lawyer to work on the stocks. Sophie accepted this with a maturity that hurt to witness. 6 years old and already fluent in the economics of survival, understanding that comfort was temporary and wealth was theoretical until proven. That evening, Rachel and Sophie explored the planetarium together properly for the first time. Moved through the damaged sections carefully, Rachel testing floor stability before allowing Sophie to follow. In the storage rooms, they found boxes of old projection slides, glass plates with astronomical images, nebulae and galaxies, and star clusters photographed in an era before digital imaging. Sophie held them to the light, marveling at the way colors shifted, asking questions about cosmic distances and stellar evolution that Rachel answered with the rusty expertise of someone who'd once taught these concepts professionally. They found Harold's personal telescope in a closet, a vintage Celestron that had been maintained with obsessive care. Rachel carried it to the main projection room, set it up beneath the collapsed dome section where the sky was visible. As darkness fell, They took turns at the eyepiece. Sophie gasped when Saturn's rings came into focus, sharp and impossibly real. Rachel felt something unlock in her chest, a reminder of why she'd fallen in love with astronomy in the first place. The universe didn't care about evictions or poverty or legal battles. It continued its patient rotation, offering wonder to anyone who looked up. "Mom, when the planetarium worked, could you see all these stars inside during the day?" Even better, the projector could show you the sky from any place on Earth, any time in history. You could watch how constellations shifted as the planet rotated, see how ancient sailors navigated by stars that don't exist anymore. Sophie's eyes lit with the kind of enthusiasm Rachel hadn't seen in months. Could we fix it? Make it work again? The question carried weight beyond simple curiosity. Rachel looked around the damaged projection room, at the Zeiss projector that had sat silent for decades, at the geodesic dome that would require serious engineering to repair. Maybe, if the stocks work out, if we actually get the money, we could restore the whole building, make it functional again, give it back to the community as something beautiful instead of abandoned. The idea took shape as she spoke, transforming from idle thought to genuine possibility. The Meridian Planetarium had been built to inspire wonder, to make the cosmos accessible to ordinary people who'd never study astronomy professionally. Harold had spent 32 years trying to preserve that mission. Rachel could continue it, fund the restoration he'd dreamed of, create something lasting instead of just consuming wealth. But first, they had to survive the waiting period, had to maintain their precarious situation in a condemned building without attracting official attention that would bring child services or building inspectors or any of the authorities who might decide Sophie's living conditions warranted intervention. The response from ComputerShare arrived via email 6 days later. Rachel opened it on her phone while sitting in the library, hands shaking too badly to hold the device steady. "Dear Ms. Torres, we have completed analysis of the Stellar Mining Corporation stock certificates you submitted for verification. Our research confirms the following. 1. All certificates are authentic original issues from the documented 1963 to 1972 period. 2. Serial numbers match our historical records for shares issued to Harold Torres. 3. No record exists of these shares being transferred, sold, or canceled. 4. Based on the merger and restructuring terms governing Stellar Mining Corporation's corporate evolution, these shares would have converted to 702,000 shares of Artemis Extraction Industries, NASDAQ, the RTX, if proper ownership continuity was maintained. Current value, $605,124,000, based on closing price $862 per share as of date. However, we note that Harold Torres did not respond to the mandatory re-registration notice sent during Artemis Extraction's 2015 restructuring. Company policy classifies non-responsive shares as abandoned after the 180-day notification period. We recommend you contact Artemis Extraction's legal department to resolve the ownership status before any transfers can be processed. Respectfully, David Chun, Senior Research Analyst. Rachel read it 3 times, each pass finding new details to either celebrate or fear. The shares were real. The value was accurate. But Artemis was going to fight, exactly as Marcus had predicted. She forwarded the email to Marcus, called him immediately. He answered sounding energized rather than concerned. "This is actually good news. ComputerShare verified authenticity and conversion rates. That means Artemis can't claim the certificates are fraudulent. Their only argument is abandonment, which we can counter if they failed proper notification. How do we prove they didn't notify Harold properly? I've already started researching. Filed a Freedom of Information request with the SEC for all documents related to Artemis's 2015 restructuring. If their notification procedures were inadequate, or if they sent letters to outdated addresses without attempting to locate shareholders, we can argue they violated fiduciary duty." Marcus paused, and Rachel heard papers rustling. "In the meantime, I sent our formal claim letter to Artemis 2 days ago. We should get their initial response within a week. Expect them to reject it outright. That's when the real fight begins. The call ended. Rachel sat in the library, surrounded by people researching family trees and reading newspapers and living lives where $600 million was theoretical rather than desperately, terrifyingly possible. She picked Sophie up from school, drove back to the planetarium, tried to act normal while her mind spun through implications. If Marcus was successful, if they actually recovered even a fraction of the stock's value, everything would change. Sophie could have stability, education, opportunities beyond survival. But the waiting was corrosive. Every day that passed felt like standing on ice that could crack without warning, plunging them back into the poverty they'd briefly escaped. The response from Artemis arrived exactly 7 days after Marcus's claim letter. Rachel received it forwarded from Marcus's office, formal corporate letterhead that dripped with expensive legal authority. Dear Mr. Webb, we are in receipt of your client's claim regarding alleged ownership of 702,000 shares of Artemis Extraction Industries. After thorough review, we have determined that the referenced shares were properly classified as abandoned pursuant to our 2015 restructuring notification requirements. All registered shareholders received written notice of mandatory re-registration. Failure to respond within the specified 180-day period resulted in share forfeiture according to terms clearly stated in the restructuring documentation. Ms. Torres' claim is denied. We consider this matter closed. Should you choose to pursue litigation, please be advised that Artemis Extraction Industries will vigorously defend our position and seek recovery of all legal costs incurred. Respectfully, Catherine Morrison, General Counsel. Rachel stared at the letter, feeling something cold settle in her chest. They'd rejected it, not even offered to negotiate, just slammed the door and threatened legal consequences if she pushed back. She called Marcus, voice shaking with anger or fear or both. They denied it. Completely. I saw. Expected, actually. But here's what's interesting. Marcus's tone carried satisfaction that fell out of place. I received the SEC documents this morning. Artemis's 2015 notification procedures were inadequate. They sent letters only to addresses listed in their 2014 shareholder registry. But they made no attempt to update addresses or locate shareholders who'd moved. Harold had moved 3 times between 2014 and 2015. His registry address was an apartment he'd vacated in 2013. Artemis's letter would have been returned as undeliverable, and they did nothing to locate him. Rachel's engineer mind locked onto the logic. So they didn't actually notify him. They made minimal effort that technically satisfied the letter of their requirements, but violated the spirit. Courts have ruled that companies have a fiduciary duty to make reasonable efforts to locate shareholders before classifying shares as abandoned. Sending one letter to an outdated address doesn't meet that standard. What happens now? Now we sue, file in federal court, argue that Artemis violated their fiduciary duty, demand they recognize your legitimate ownership. Discovery will be expensive for them, depositions will. Expose their inadequate notification practices, and eventually they'll realize settling is cheaper than fighting. Marcus paused. But Rachel, you need to understand something. This lawsuit will take time. Minimum 1 year, possibly 3. During that period, Artemis will investigate you thoroughly. They'll look for anything that undermines your credibility or suggests you're not fit to own significant equity. The implied threat was clear. Living in a condemned building with a 6-year-old would absolutely be used against her. Rachel felt the trap closing, the impossible choice between maintaining her claim and ensuring Sophie's immediate safety. What if they report me to child services? Argue that I'm an unfit parent using my daughter to gain sympathy. Then we document everything showing you're providing for Sophie to the best of your ability. Get her regular medical checkups, maintain school attendance, keep the planetarium's livable areas clean and safe. Make it impossible for them to claim neglect. Rachel ended the call and sat in the basement room that had become their home, looking at Sophie doing homework at Harold's desk, completely unaware that her mother's fight for their future might require sacrificing her daughter's present comfort. That night, Rachel made a decision. She couldn't fix the entire planetarium, but she could make the basement truly livable. Used $1,200 from the meteorite money to buy a space heater that worked properly, LED lighting that didn't strain eyes, a real bed frame and mattress for Sophie. Hired a handyman to install a basic shower in the basement bathroom, upgrading the utility sink into something functional. Bought a camping toilet that was more dignified than the bucket system they'd been using. The improvements transformed the basement from desperate shelter into marginal apartment. Still not ideal, still not what Sophie deserved, but defensible if inspectors came asking questions. 2 weeks after Artemis's rejection letter, Marcus filed the federal lawsuit. Torres versus Artemis Extraction Industries, claiming wrongful denial of shareholder rights, inadequate notification procedures, and violation of fiduciary duty. The news hit financial media within hours. Bloomberg ran a story. Mysterious shareholder claims $605 million in long-lost mining stock. The article was factual but sensational, painting Rachel as either a legitimate heir or an opportunist trying to exploit corporate record-keeping failures. Rachel's phone started ringing. Reporters, other lawyers offering their services, investment advisors promising to help manage wealth she didn't have yet. She ignored all of it, focused on maintaining Sophie's routine while the media storm swirled. Sophie's teacher called 3 days after the lawsuit was filed, voice carefully neutral. "Ms. Torres, I wanted to check in about Sophie. Some parents have mentioned seeing news articles about your family. I want to make sure Sophie's okay." The subtext was clear. "We're watching, we're concerned, don't give us reason to intervene. Sophie's fine. We're dealing with a complicated estate situation, but her needs are being met. She's attending school regularly. Her grades are good. She's healthy and safe. Of course, I just wanted to confirm. Let me know if there's anything the school can do to support her during this transition." The call ended, leaving Rachel with the distinct impression that Child Services had already been contacted, that investigation was underway, disguised as concern support. She doubled down on documentation, took Sophie to a pediatrician for a full checkup, got written confirmation of good health, photographed the basement living space showing its improvements, created a file of Sophie's school attendance records, her homework assignments, evidence of engaged parenting despite their circumstances. The legal battle had begun in earnest. Discovery requests from Artemis demanded every detail of Rachel's life, Harold's estate, the chain of inheritance. Marcus countered with equally aggressive demands for Artemis's 2015 notification records, shareholder communications, internal emails discussing abandoned share policies. And through it all, Rachel and Sophie live in the basement of a condemned planetarium, maintaining their fragile normalcy while $600 million hung in legal limbo, simultaneously within reach and impossibly distant. 1 month after the lawsuit was filed, Rachel stood in the main projection room at night, looking up through the collapsed dome at stars that had witnessed everything. Witnessed Harold's decades of patient restoration. Witnessed Rachel's desperate arrival. Witnessed Sophie's resilience through circumstances no child should endure. The Zeiss projector sat silent in the center of the room, waiting for someone to bring it back to life. Rachel had researched restoration costs during idle moments between legal stress. $200,000 to repair the projection system. $800,000 to fix the dome. Maybe $2 million total to make the planetarium functional again. Pocket change if the lawsuit succeeded. Impossible fantasy if it failed. But either way, Rachel had started to believe, not in guaranteed outcomes, but in the possibility that Harold's final gift might actually transform their lives. That desperation had led her to exactly where she needed to be, that the stars overhead would continue their patient rotation while human struggles played out beneath them. She heard footsteps behind her. Sophie, wrapped in a blanket, padding across the floor in bare feet. "Mom, are we going to win?" Rachel pulled her daughter close, both of them looking up at the cosmos visible through broken architecture. "I don't know, baby, but we're going to fight like Grandpa Harold taught us. Patient and stubborn, and believing the future will prove us right, even if it takes a long time." Even then, they stood together in the darkness, two people against a corporation worth billions, armed with nothing but legitimate claim and the desperate hope that justice sometimes actually worked. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles but bearing witness nonetheless. The fight had begun. The stakes were impossibly high, and Rachel Torres, homeless single mother and former planetarium director, was going to see it through to whatever end awaited. Because she had no other choice, and because Harold had believed she could. The deposition lasted 7 hours. Rachel sat across from 3 Artemis extraction attorneys in a conference room that smelled like leather and intimidation, answering questions designed to make her look unstable, opportunistic, or incompetent. Ms. Torres, you're currently residing in a condemned building with your minor daughter. Is that correct? Marcus touched her arm gently, the signal they practiced. Stay calm. Answer truthfully. Don't get defensive. I'm residing in the property I inherited from my grandfather, yes. The basement has been upgraded to safe, livable conditions. A condemned building that the county has declared structurally unsound. The condemnation applies to the main dome structure. The basement foundation is solid concrete, professionally assessed as stable. I have engineering reports if you'd like to see them. The lead attorney, a woman named Patricia Brennan with silver hair and a smile like a scalpel, shuffled papers with theatrical precision. Ms. Torres, isn't it true that you were evicted from your previous residence? That you've been homeless multiple times over the past year? I faced financial hardship after my divorce and job loss, yes. That's why inheriting my grandfather's property was so important. It provided stability when I had none. Stability in a condemned planetarium. Marcus intervened smoothly. Is there a question, counselor? Or are you just editorializing about my client's economic circumstances? Brennan's expression didn't change. Let me ask directly. Ms. Torres, how did you discover these allegedly valuable stock certificates in a building you'd never visited before inheriting it? Rachel had prepared for this question. Knew it was the crux of Artemis's strategy. Paint her as a treasure hunter who'd manufactured a convenient inheritance claim. My grandfather left a letter directing me to search the building. He'd hidden the certificates in a concealed chamber beneath the projection platform. The letter included instructions on how to access it. How convenient. And this letter just happened to lead you to $600 million in stock certificates. The letter led me to my grandfather's life work. The certificates were part of that legacy. Brennan leaned forward, voice carrying practiced skepticism. Ms. Torres, your grandfather died in November 2024. You didn't attend his funeral. You'd had no contact with him for over 20 years. Why should we believe he intended to leave you anything, let alone his entire estate? The question stung because it touched truth Rachel had been avoiding. She hadn't been there when Harold died, hadn't known about the funeral until weeks after, had been too consumed by her own survival to think about a grandfather she barely remembered. Harold will names me as sole heir. That's a legal document, not a matter of opinion. It was written in 1996, before you were married, before you had a child, before any of your current circumstances. Perhaps he would have revised it if he'd known how your life turned out. Marcus stood abruptly. This deposition is over. You've crossed from discovery into harassment. We'll see you in court. They left the conference room, Rachel's hands shaking from suppressed anger. In the parking garage, Marcus turned to her with unexpected gentleness. You did well. They were trying to rattle you, make you lose composure. You stayed calm, answered truthfully. That's all we need. They made me sound like a con artist, like I'm exploiting Harold's death for money. They made themselves sound desperate. Did you notice how Brennan kept circling back to the same questions? That's because they don't have a strong defense. The certificates are authentic, the inheritance is legal, and their notification procedures were inadequate. Everything else is noise meant to distract from those facts. Rachel leaned against the Honda, exhaustion pulling at her like gravity. How much longer is this going to take? Trial is scheduled for September. 5 months. But I think they'll settle before then. The discovery process is exposing problems they don't want public. Marcus pulled out his tablet, showed Rachel documents they'd received from Artemis during discovery. Internal emails from 2015 discussing the restructuring, executive communications about cleaning up the shareholder registry by eliminating inactive accounts. One email made Rachel's breath catch. We can acquire abandoned shares at pennies on the dollar if we keep notification requirements minimal. Legal says we're technically compliant even if we don't try too hard to locate old shareholders. This is fraud. They deliberately failed to notify people so they could steal their shares. It's evidence of intent, which is exactly what we need to prove they violated fiduciary duty. I'm going to use this to pressure them into settlement negotiations. The legal battle continued through spring into summer, each side filing motions and counter-motions, building their cases for trial. Rachel's life contracted to three focuses: Sophie, the lawsuit, and gradually restoring the planetarium into something defensible. She used more meteorite money to hire contractors, fixing the basement's plumbing completely, installing proper electrical wiring, creating a living space that could pass inspection if child services came calling. The improvements cost $8,000 but bought peace of mind. Sophie thrived despite the chaos. Her second-grade teacher reported excellent progress, made no further concerning calls about their living situation. Sophie had friends now, attended birthday parties, brought home artwork that Rachel hung on the basement walls like gallery pieces. On weekends, they explored the planetarium together. Rachel taught Sophie basic astronomy, showed her how to identify constellations, explained the mechanics of celestial motion. The building became their classroom, the damage domed their portal to understanding cosmic scale. One Saturday in June, while cleaning out storage rooms, they found something Rachel had missed during initial exploration. A metal filing cabinet buried beneath old promotional materials, locked with a combination lock that had seized from disuse. Rachel broke it open with bolt cutters borrowed from the handyman, found the cabinet filled with Harold's personal journals. 30 years of daily entries, documenting his work on the planetarium, his thoughts about astronomy and life, and the granddaughter he'd met so briefly. Rachel sat on the floor reading while Sophie played nearby, discovering a grandfather she'd never known through his own words. March 15th, 1998, Rachel visited today with her mother. She's 7, curious about everything. I showed her the star projector, and she asked how we make mechanical stars bright enough to fool people into thinking they're real. Smart question. I try to explain lumens and projection angles, but mostly I think she just liked that I took her seriously. I wonder what she'll become. She has the mind for science if anyone encourages it. But Linda seems determined to leave, take Rachel away from these mountains, chase opportunities in the city. I understand wanting better for your child. I just hope Linda realizes that better isn't always measured in paychecks and zip codes. The entry was dated 2 weeks before Rachel's mother had moved them to Portland, beginning the separation that would last until Linda's death. Rachel felt grief crack open fresh, mourning not just her mother, but the relationship with Harold that had been sacrificed to Linda's ambitions. She kept reading, found entries from years later. October 3rd, 2010, learned Linda died last year. Cancer, they said. Nobody told me until I tried calling her number and got a disconnected message. Tracked down Rachel's information through public records. She's married now, living in Riverside, working at the planetarium there. I thought about reaching out, but what would I say? Sorry I wasn't there for your mother's funeral. Sorry I let 20 years pass without contact. Some distances can't be crossed without causing more pain than connection would heal. Rachel's vision blurred. Harold had known about her career, had tracked her life from a distance, had chosen silence over awkward reconnection. The decision made sense and hurt simultaneously. The final entries from weeks before Harold's death carried a different tone. October 28th, 2024, my health is failing. Doctor says maybe 6 months, maybe less. I need to finalize plans for the planetarium, for the stocks, for Rachel. I've been checking on her periodically through social media, public records. She divorced 2 years ago, lost her job at the Riverside Planetarium when they cut funding. I saw a photo from her LinkedIn. She looks exhausted, older than 34 should look. The kind of tired that comes from fighting battles you're losing. She's going to need help. and I have help to give if I can get it to her the right way. I'm sealing the stock certificates in the foundation chamber, writing instructions that will only make sense if she's desperate enough to actually search. Because desperation makes people humble enough to see what's actually there instead of what they want to find. I learned that lesson myself back in the lean years. When you have nothing, you notice everything. When you have resources, you stop paying attention. Rachel needs to find this when she has nothing. That's when it'll mean what it should mean. Rachel closed the journal, tears tracking down her face. Harold had been watching, had seen her struggles, had orchestrated his final gift with precision that took her breath away. He'd hidden the certificates not from paranoia, but from wisdom. Had understood that wealth given too easily corrupted, that value discovered through necessity, taught lessons prosperity never could. Sophie climbed in her mother's lap, small arms wrapping tight. "Why are you crying?" "Because Grandpa Harold loved us. Even though we never really knew him, he was trying to take care of us. Is that why he left the treasure?" Rachel smoothed her daughter's hair, feeling gratitude and grief braided together. "Yes, baby, that's exactly why." In July, Marcus called with news that made Rachel's heart leap. Artemis wants to negotiate. They're not calling it settlement yet, but they've requested a mediation session. That's significant movement. The mediation happened in a neutral conference room, facilitated by a retired judge named Howard Chun, who specialized in complex securities disputes. Artemis sent a team of 5 attorneys led by Patricia Brennan. Marcus and Rachel sat across from them, outnumbered but not outmatched. Judge Chin opened with procedural remarks about confidentiality and good faith negotiation. Then Brennan spoke, her tone suggesting she was offering generous concession rather than responding to legal pressure. "Ms. Torres, Artemis recognizes that your grandfather was a longtime shareholder who contributed to the company's early success. We want to resolve this matter fairly and avoid protracted litigation." Marcus's expression stayed carefully neutral. "What are you proposing?" "We're prepared to offer $50 million. Cash payment, transferred within 30 days, in exchange for Ms. Torres releasing all claims to the disputed shares." The number landed like a physical blow. $50 million. More money than Rachel had imagined possessing in 10 lifetimes. Enough to transform everything, to give Sophie opportunities beyond dreams. But it was also $555 million less than the share's actual value. An offer designed to sound generous while being fundamentally insulting. Marcus didn't hesitate. The shares are worth $605 million based on current trading prices. Your offer represents less than 10% of their legitimate value. That's not negotiation. That's lowballing someone you think is too desperate to fight. Brennan's smile stayed fixed. The share's theoretical value is irrelevant if Ms. Torres can't prove legitimate ownership. We're offering $50 million to avoid litigation risk on both sides. Your own discovery documents show deliberate failure to notify shareholders. You're not offering $50 million from generosity. You're offering it because you know we'll win at trial and you're trying to limit damages. The mediation session deteriorated into positional bargaining. Artemis raised their offer to $75 million. Marcus countered at $500 million. They settled in a stalemate at $100 million versus $450 million, neither side willing to move further. Judge Chun called a recess. Rachel and Marcus huddled in a side room, while Artemis's team occupied another. "What do you think?" Rachel's voice came out smaller than intended. $100 million is life-changing money. It's also $500 million less than you're owed. But Rachel, this is your decision. If you want to take their offer, I'll negotiate the best terms possible and we'll walk away today with certainty. Rachel thought about Sophie, about security, about the difference between $100 million and $500 million when both numbers exceeded comprehension. Thought about Harold spending 32 years restoring the planetarium with patience that never wavered. "What would you do?" Marcus met her eyes with unexpected intensity. "I'd fight, because they're desperate and we're winning. Because their internal emails prove fraud. Because you deserve what's legally yours, not what they're willing to concede." Then we fight. When mediation resumed, Marcus delivered their position with finality. $450 million, or we'll see you at trial. Those are the only options. Brennan's professional mask slipped slightly. You're making a mistake. Trial means years of litigation, mounting costs, public scrutiny of your client's circumstances. Is that really what you want for your daughter, Ms. Torres? Years of her childhood consumed by legal battles. Rachel felt anger cut through fear. You're trying to use my daughter as leverage, suggesting that being a good mother means accepting less than I'm owed. That's not negotiation. That's manipulation. I'm suggesting that certainty has value, especially for a single mother living in a condemned building. Marcus stood. This mediation is over. We'll let the court decide. They left Artemis's team, still seated, Brennan's expression suggesting she'd miscalculated badly. In the parking lot, Marcus turned to Rachel with something approaching admiration. That was brave. Walking away from $100 million takes courage most people don't have. Harold didn't hide those certificates, so I could accept pennies on the dollar. He wanted me to fight for what was actually mine. The trial date approached like a storm on the horizon, inevitable and potentially devastating. Rachel prepared by documenting everything. Sophie's school records, medical checkups, the planetarium's improvements, evidence of responsible parenting despite their unconventional circumstances. The media attention intensified. Local news ran stories about the planetarium heiress, profiles that painted Rachel as either inspiring underdog or opportunistic fraud, depending on the outlet's editorial slant. Reporters camped outside the planetarium, took photographs of Sophie leaving for school, created spectacle from their lives. Rachel shielded Sophie as much as possible, explained that some people were curious about Grandpa Harold's gift, that the attention would pass once the court made its decision. Sophie handled it with remarkable composure, seemed to understand instinctively that staying calm helped her mother stay strong. 2 weeks before trial, Marcus received a call from Brennan requesting emergency meeting. They met at a coffee shop in neutral territory, just the two attorneys, preliminary discussion before bringing clients into negotiation. Marcus called Rachel afterward, voice carrying barely suppressed excitement. They're panicking. The judge denied their motion to exclude the internal emails from evidence. That means the jury will see documentation of their deliberate failure to notify shareholders. Brennan knows how that's going to play at trial. What did she offer? $300 million. Final offer, take it or leave it, expires in 48 hours. Rachel sat down hard. Phone pressed to her ear. $300 million. Half of what the shares were worth, but still generational wealth beyond comprehension. What do you think? Marcus paused, choosing words carefully. I think we could win $500 million at trial. I also think there's a 20% chance we lose everything if the jury decides the notification procedures were technically adequate, even if morally bankrupt. $300 million is certain. Trial is a gamble. Rachel thought about Sophie, about the planetarium, about Harold's patient belief that the future would prove him right. Thought about whether $300 million versus $500 million actually mattered when both represented more money than she could spend in 5 lifetimes. Counter at $400 million. If they accept, we settle. If not, we go to trial. Marcus laughed, genuine delight in his voice. I love working with engineers. You think in optimization rather than absolutes. The counteroffer went out that evening. Rachel waited through a sleepless night while Artemis's board considered their options. At 9 a.m. the next morning, Marcus called. They accepted. $400 million, paid in full within 60 days, in exchange for releasing all claims and signing confidentiality agreements about the settlement terms. Rachel's legs stopped working. She sat on the basement floor while Marcus explained the next steps, the paperwork that would need signing, the tax implications that would reduce $400 million to approximately $240 million after federal and state obligations. Marcus gets 25%, which is $100 million. That leaves you with $140 million net after all taxes and fees. $140 million. The number existed in a realm beyond Rachel's ability to process emotionally. She'd been counting dollars and quarters 18 months ago. had sold meteorites for $5,000 and felt wealthy, had walked away from $100 million to fight for what was fair. And now she'd won. Not completely. Artemis had still paid less than full value, but substantially enough that Rachel could provide for Sophie's future, restore the planetarium, honor Harold's legacy in ways that mattered. When do I sign? I'll have documents ready by end of week. We'll meet in my office, go through everything line by line, make sure you understand what you're agreeing to. The signing happened on a Friday afternoon in August. Rachel read every page of the 67-page settlement agreement, asked questions about provisions she didn't understand, initialed every amendment and clause. The final signature felt impossibly light, just ink on paper, transforming her legal status from desperate plaintiff to woman of substantial means. Marcus shook her hand with genuine warmth. Congratulations, Rachel. You earned this through patience and courage. Your grandfather would be proud. The wire transfer arrived 58 days later, 3 days ahead of schedule. Rachel's phone buzzed with a notification from her bank, a text message that seemed absurdly casual for its content. Incoming wire transfer, $140 million. Available balance, $140,003,847.52. Rachel stared at the screen until the numbers stopped meaning anything, until they became abstract symbols divorced from purchasing power or real-world implications. She was wealthy, generationally, absurdly, impossibly wealthy, and she had absolutely no idea what to do next. The first thing Rachel did was nothing. For 3 days, she maintained exact routine, dropped Sophie at school, bought groceries, worked on small planetarium improvements, picked Sophie up at 3 p.m. The money sat in her account like unexploded ordnance, present but not yet activated. On the 4th day, she hired a financial advisor recommended by Marcus. Elizabeth Park, a woman in her 50s who specialized in sudden wealth management, helping lottery winners and inheritance recipients avoid the disasters that typically followed financial windfalls. They met in Elizabeth's office, where Rachel explained her situation with the clinical precision of someone describing someone else's life. I have $140 million. I want to make sure my daughter is provided for, restore the planetarium my grandfather loved, and use the rest to do something meaningful. I don't know what meaningful looks like yet. Elizabeth smiled with the patience of someone who'd had this conversation before. Let's start with security, then build toward purpose. First priority is protecting what you have. She outlined a strategy: $50 million in conservative investments, index funds, and municipal bonds that would generate passive income without risk. $30 million in a trust for Sophie, structured to provide for education and living expenses while preventing her from accessing bulk funds until age 30. $20 million liquid for immediate needs and opportunities. That left $40 million for the planetarium restoration and whatever else Rachel decided mattered. Before you spend anything significant, take 6 months. Let the shock wear off. Get used to being wealthy. Make decisions from clarity rather than reaction. Rachel appreciated the wisdom, but couldn't wait 6 months. The planetarium needed immediate attention before winter weather caused additional damage. And she'd already decided what Harold's gift meant. Not just personal security, but community restoration. She hired structural engineers to assess the building comprehensively, paid $15,000 for detailed reports on every system. The findings were both encouraging and daunting. The foundation was solid, exactly as Rachel had assessed. The basement could support significant loads. But the geodesic dome needed extensive repair, replacing damaged panels, reinforcing the framework, waterproofing the entire structure. Cost estimate, $1.2 million. The Zeiss projector was salvageable but required complete restoration by specialists. $300,000 to disassemble, repair, and recalibrate. Electrical, plumbing, HVAC, accessibility compliance, safety systems. The costs accumulated to $3.8 million for complete restoration that would meet modern building codes while preserving the structure's historic character. Rachel approved all of it, signed contracts with preservation specialists who understood geodesic architecture, hired the best planetarium equipment technicians in the country, committed to doing the restoration properly rather than cheaply. Construction began in October. Rachel and Sophie moved to a rented house in Riverside proper, a modest 3-bedroom that felt palatial after the basement, but was deliberately unremarkable. Rachel refused to buy a mansion or flash wealth that would make Sophie's childhood abnormal. They visited the planetarium daily, watched workers repair the dome panel by panel, saw the projection platform restored to original condition, witnessed the Zeiss projector being carefully disassembled and rebuilt with obsessive precision. Sophie asked the questions Rachel had been avoiding. "Are we rich now, Mom?" "Like really rich." They sat in the rented house's living room, evening light streaming through ordinary windows, having a conversation Rachel had been dreading. "Yes, we're wealthy. Grandpa Harold's gift was worth a lot of money, and we were able to claim it." "How much money?" Rachel chose honesty. "Enough that you'll never have to worry about being homeless or hungry. Enough that you can go to any college you want, become anything you want to be." Sophie processed this with her characteristic seriousness. "What about other kids? The ones whose grandpas didn't leave them treasure?" The question cut straight to the moral complexity Rachel had been wrestling with. She pulled Sophie close, tried to find language for concepts that challenged even her adult understanding. "That's a hard question, baby. We were lucky in ways most people aren't. Grandpa Harold worked hard and made smart investments, but he also had opportunities not everyone gets. The money doesn't make us better than other people. It just means we have more resources. So what do we do with the resources?" Rachel felt something unlock in her chest. 6 years old, and Sophie had identified the central question, the one that would define whether Harold's gift became blessing or curse. "We use them to help people. We restore the planetarium and open it for free to schools that can't afford field trips. We support programs that help families who are struggling like we were. We remember what it felt like to have nothing, and we make sure we never forget." Sophie nodded, satisfied. "That sounds like what Grandpa Harold would want." The Meridian Planetarium reopened on June 15th, 18 months after Rachel had first discovered Harold's hidden chamber. The dome gleamed white against the desert sky, geodesic panels creating geometric perfection. Inside, the Zeiss projector sat centered on its restored platform, ready to transform the ceiling into cosmos. The grand opening was free to the public. Rachel hired educators to run shows every hour, demonstrating the projection system's capabilities, showing audiences the sky from any place on Earth at any time in history. 600 people attended that first day, families and school groups, and astronomy enthusiasts who remembered the original Meridian from decades past. Rachel stood in the back of the projection room during the final show, watching children's faces illuminate with wonder as artificial stars wheeled overhead. Heard their gasps when the Milky Way resolved into billions of individual points of light. Saw the same fascination she'd felt at 7 when Harold had shown her star charts and taken her question seriously. A reporter from the Riverside Press approached, notebook ready. "Ms. Torres, this restoration cost nearly $4 million by our estimates. You could have sold the land for development, made a profit without the expense. Why restore a planetarium?" Rachel had prepared for this question, knew it would come. "My grandfather spent 32 years trying to preserve this building because he believes some things are worth saving beyond their monetary value. Planetariums teach us cosmic perspective, that our problems are real, but not the whole universe. That understanding our place in the cosmos makes us better humans. And it's all free admission. The planetarium is funded through an endowment. School groups, families, anyone curious about astronomy can attend shows without cost. Knowledge shouldn't have a price tag." The article ran the next day, accompanied by photographs of the restored dome and children staring upward with expressions of pure wonder. Other media picked it up, a feel-good story about wealth used properly, restoration instead of consumption, community benefit rather than personal aggrandizement. Rachel avoided most interview requests, uncomfortable with attention that made her heroic for simply doing what felt right. But she accepted an invitation from NPR, figuring radio meant she could discuss ideas without visual spectacle. The interview was thoughtful, probing. The host asked about Harold, about the discovery, about the legal battle. Rachel answered honestly, described the desperation that had led her to search, the patience required to fight Artemis, the responsibility that came with winning. What advice would you give to people facing similar desperation? When you're homeless with a child and everything feels impossible. Rachel paused, searching for truth that wouldn't sound like platitudes. I'd say that sometimes the things we think are endings are actually redirections towards something we couldn't have imagined. I didn't want to be evicted, didn't want to live in a condemned building. But that desperation led me to discover my grandfather's gift in a way I wouldn't have if my life had been stable. I'd also say that worth isn't measured by financial circumstances. Sophie and I weren't less valuable when we were sleeping in a basement. The money revealed opportunities we already deserved. It didn't create them. The interview aired during morning drive time, reached millions of listeners. Rachel received hundreds of emails afterward, people sharing their own stories of hardship and resilience, thanking her for normalizing struggle without making it romantic. One email stood out from a woman named Jennifer Chun, the estate attorney who'd first contacted Rachel about Harold's inheritance. Dear Rachel, I wanted you to know that your grandfather came to our office in October 2024, 1 month before he died. He was very specific about his will, about making sure you were listed as sole heir. He said you'd need the planetarium and everything in it, that you were going to face hard times, and he wanted to give you tools to rebuild. I asked if he wanted to contact you directly, let you know about the inheritance before he passed. He said no, that you needed to find it when you were desperate enough to search properly, that receiving help you hadn't earned would corrupt it. He was a difficult client, very particular about language in the will, very insistent that we keep trying to locate you even if initial contact attempts failed. I thought you should know how deliberately he planned this gift. Your grandfather loved you very much, even from a distance. Regards, Jennifer. Rachel read the email 3 times, tears blurring the screen. Harold had known, had seen her struggles, and orchestrated his final gift with precision that took into account not just financial need, but timing, emotional readiness, the humility that came from having nothing. She printed the email, added it to the journals and letters she was collecting. Sophie's inheritance wouldn't just be money. It would be the story of how they'd received it, the lessons embedded in Harold's patience, the understanding that wealth meant responsibility. 6 months after the planetarium reopened, Rachel established the Harold Torres Foundation with an initial endowment of $20 million. The mission was specific, supporting single parents facing homelessness, providing not just shelter, but pathways to stability. The foundation offered emergency housing grants, legal aid, job training, childcare support, all the resources Rachel had desperately needed during her worst months. The first year helped 83 families. Success rates were high because the program addressed root causes rather than symptoms, gave people time and support to rebuild rather than temporary relief followed by renewed crisis. Rachel stayed involved in program design, but hired experienced directors to run operations. She attended board meetings, reviewed applications, met occasionally with families the foundation had helped, heard echoes of her own story in their struggles, understood how precarious stability was for anyone without resources. One recipient was a woman named Maria Santos, 28, 2 children, fleeing domestic violence with $47 and no support network. The foundation provided housing, legal aid for the divorce and custody battle, job training and medical coding that led to stable employment. A year later, Maria sent Rachel a photo, her and her children in their own apartment, smiling with the cautious hope of people learning to trust good fortune. The note said simply, "Thank you for seeing us when we were invisible." Rachel hung the photo in the planetarium's office, added it to the growing collection of families who'd found stability through Harold's gift indirectly shared. Each image represented someone who wouldn't become a statistic, whose children wouldn't grow up homeless, whose desperation had met help instead of judgment. Sophie grew up different from other children of wealth. She attended public school rather than private academy, wore normal clothes rather than designer labels, had chores and responsibilities that taught work's value. Rachel was deliberate about this. determined that money wouldn't corrupt her daughter's character. On Sophie's 10th birthday, Rachel took her to the planetarium for a private showing. They sat alone in the projection room, while the Zeiss projector filled the dome with stars, the sky wheeling overhead in patterns that had guided humans for millennia. "Mom, do you think Grandpa Harold knew this would happen? That would be okay." Rachel considered the question seriously. "I think he hoped. He couldn't know for certain, but he trusted that if we needed help badly enough, we'd find what he left. And that finding it would teach us something about patience and perseverance." "What did it teach you?" "That wealth is responsibility, not just possession. That having resources means you can help others who are struggling. That some gifts are meant to be shared rather than hoarded." Sophie leaned against her mother, both of them watching artificial cosmos rotate above. "When I'm older, can I help run the foundation?" "If you want to. But you can also become anything else: scientist, teacher, artist, anything that calls to you. The money gives you freedom to choose purpose instead of just survival. I want to help people like the foundation helps them. Because we were them once." Rachel felt something settle in her chest, a sense that Harold's gift had accomplished exactly what he'd intended. Not just rescuing two people from poverty, but creating generational understanding that wealth carried obligations beyond comfort. The years accumulated. The foundation helped its 1,000th family. The planetarium served its 100,000th visitor. Sophie graduated high school with honors, accepted admission to MIT to study aerospace engineering, choosing a path that honored both her mother's and great-grandfather's legacies. Rachel marked Sophie's 18th birthday by transferring control of the trust Harold's settlement had funded. $30 million that would provide for Sophie's future, ensure she never faced the desperation her mother had known. They sat in the planetarium office, reviewing the trust documents, discussing what wealth meant and how to use it wisely. "You know you don't have to work, right?" Rachel kept her voice neutral, not pushing toward any particular choice. "The trust generates enough income that you could live comfortably without employment." Sophie looked at her mother with an expression that reminded Rachel of Harold: patient determination, quiet certainty. Grandpa Harold worked his whole life, even when he had valuable stocks. "You kept working even after the settlement." "Why would I be different?" "Because you have options we didn't have. I have the option to do meaningful work without worrying about survival. That's different for not working. I want to design spacecraft systems, help humanity explore beyond Earth. The money means I can pursue that without financial pressure, but it doesn't mean I should waste my potential on nothing." Rachel pulled her daughter into a hug that lasted longer than Sophie probably appreciated. 18 years old and already understanding what took most people lifetimes to learn, that purpose mattered more than comfort, that wealth was tools rather than identity. On the 20th anniversary of Harold's death, Rachel organized a memorial at the planetarium. Public event, free admission, celebrating his life and the legacy he'd created. 300 people attended. Families helped by the foundation, students who'd attended planetarium shows, astronomy enthusiasts who remembered Harold from his equipment repair work decades prior. Rachel spoke briefly, standing beneath the dome Harold had spent 32 years preserving. "My grandfather was a patient man. He waited decades for asteroid mining to become viable, proving his early investments right. He waited years for me to need his gift badly enough to search for it properly. He understood that some things require time to ripen into usefulness." The Meridian Planetarium stands today because Harold refused to let it die. The foundation helps families because he gave me resources and trusted I'd share them. His legacy isn't the money. It's the understanding that wealth means opportunity to serve rather than just consume. I never really knew him. We met twice when I was very small. But his final gift taught me more about love than a lifetime of conventional relationship could have. He saw me when I was invisible. He prepared for my desperation before I knew desperation was coming. He believed I'd use his gift wisely, and that belief made me determined to prove him right. The crowd was silent. Rachel looked up at the dome, at the projection platform where Harold's hidden chamber had waited patiently, felt his presence like a physical thing, approval radiating from the structure he'd loved. That night, after everyone had left, Rachel and Sophie sat alone in the projection room. The Zeiss projector filled the dome with stars, artificial cosmos that felt as real as the universe beyond. "Do you think we did okay, Mom? With everything Grandpa Harold gave us?" Rachel thought about the 20 years since that November storm had revealed the hidden chamber. The legal battles, the Foundation's work, the Planetarium's resurrection, the 1,000 small decisions that had shaped how Harold's gift rippled outward. "I think we honored his intention. We used the money to build rather than just consume. We helped people the way we wish someone had helped us. We remembered what it felt like to have nothing, and we never let wealth make us forget." Sophie nodded, satisfied. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles but bearing witness nonetheless. The universe didn't care about inheritance or lawsuits or foundations, but it provided the cosmic perspective that made human efforts meaningful. The understanding that individual lives were brief, but the ripples they created could extend across generations. Harold had created ripples. Rachel had amplified them. Sophie would carry them forward. And somewhere, in the patient rotation of stars overhead, that seemed like enough. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.